So thanks, Lisa. It is great to be in Minneapolis. I have to give their Chamber of Commerce credit for really beautiful weather. It's pretty cool outside. So I think it's very appropriate that our first program is talking about early childhood education. That's been a priority of this Chamber of Commerce for years, and we've made progress, but there's more progress to be made. So today we have a special guest, Neel Kashkari, who is the chair of the Federal Reserve here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, strong advocate for early childhood education. Neel told me to keep his bio short because we wanted to get to questions, but it's pretty impressive. He came out of the aerospace industry and has been leader here at the Fed for a number of years. So I think we'll just jump right into it. Neel, if you can talk a little bit, some people think it's odd or maybe a little different that the Fed would be involved in this issue. This Federal Reserve Bank has been involved in early childhood education and the research behind that for a number of years. Perhaps you could just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to see such a terrific turnout from Kansas City here in Minnesota. And I know you all know you have a Kansas City Fed, which are good friends of ours. And so when I heard you were visiting, I was honored to get the invitation to address you. So thank you. A couple things. Let me back up for a second. So why did the Minneapolis Fed, for literally decades, the Minneapolis Fed has been studying the issue of early childhood development. And let me tell you why. I'm going to tell you the short story, which is funny, and then I'm going to tell you the more serious answer. The short story, which is funny, which is probably not going to make me popular with this audience, is for decades, economists have been saying government spending taxpayer money on stadiums is a lousy investment. And some people in Minnesota said, okay, smarty pants, if it's a lousy investment to spend money on stadiums, what should we spend money on? And they did a bunch of work, and they said, you know, the single best return that we can come up with for taxpayer money is investing in the early childhood education of low-income kids. That has the best return to taxpayers over the long term, over anything else our economists could look at. So that's actually the funny story of how we got into it. Why have we stayed in it? Because the Federal Reserve has two goals that you may have heard about. We call them our dual mandate that Congress has assigned us. One of which is stable prices, 2% inflation. You know, we're not all the way there yet, but we're making progress getting inflation back down. And the other is maximum employment, as many Americans gainfully employed and contributing to our economy. And it turns out education is enormously important to maximum employment. If you want to have more Americans gainfully employed, hopefully in good jobs, contributing to our society, obviously education is absolutely a critical issue for there. So we've spent the last couple decades studying issues around educational attainment, education disparities, because it is so tightly linked back to our maximum employment mandate. And what does it mean to be at maximum employment? You actually have to understand how well are our citizenry educated. It's a key component.
So I know the state passed a constitutional amendment that guarantees quality education for all. And what I understand is the research that the Fed did, and trust me, it's cited way past, Minnesota. I mean, it's cited across the country. We talk about it a lot in Missouri, but how do you think the research that the Fed did all those years ago and the continuing research led to moving the state forward? Again, it's a little bit out of what some would think of the norm of the Fed, but the research was key, as I understand it, in passing that constitutional amendment.
So just to clarify, the constitutional amendment that you're talking about, what we call the Page Amendment, was not passed.
Okay.
The legislature did not take it forward. In Minnesota, different states are different. For a constitutional amendment to go to the voters, it has to go through the state legislature first. Not all states, I'm not sure what it is in Missouri, not all states is that true. But Minneapolis Fed's research on the value of investing in early education has actually been cited in many, many states around the country who are just looking at the raw economic analysis, not partisanship, but what does the data show? And the data shows that investing in, especially for low-income families, this can make a huge difference in the outcome for those kids as they get older. Now let me back up for a second. My wife and I have two young children. I have a 5-year-old daughter who just started kindergarten, and we have a 3-year-old son who's still in daycare. Now we're fortunate that we are able to afford very high quality childcare for both of our children before our daughter entered kindergarten. Not every family is so fortunate. And the economic analysis shows if you spend taxpayer money on me and my family, that is not a great use of taxpayer money because we already have the means to make sure that our kids are getting that head start from their earliest years. But if you spend that money on the low-income families who do not otherwise have access to that, that's where it can really make a difference. And that's where the economic analysis was so powerful. And it has made a big difference in Minnesota and in many other states who have cited that research and said, look, this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of economics at the end of the day, of how competitive do we want our states to be and our labor market to be.
Okay, excellent. So I actually give you guys credit for passing that
Well,
constitutional amendment.
thank you for that, but I'll be honest with you, even when it's not in my favor.
So talk a little bit about, I think people look at educational statistics from across the country. I mean, Minnesota is, very high educational attainment as a state, but there are also still gaps. How do you begin to address those gaps, and what are the challenges there so that it really does lift everybody up? So,
there's one of the neat things about our country is we have 50 states that all have their own policies. We have, in some sense, a 50-state laboratory. And while Minnesota has historically had very high-quality schools on average, very good performance on average, in recent decades, those averages have masked some of the worst educational disparities in the country. They're both racial disparities, but they're also socioeconomic disparities. Low-income white children in Minnesota are badly trailing their more well-to-do peers. And these gaps are some of the biggest in the country. And Minnesota, if I'm going to be honest with you, in the last 20 or 30 years, we've not made any progress in closing those gaps. But if you look around the country, some states have made progress. This is not an impossible problem to solve. It does take will to bring people together to actually lead to some transformational change. One of the most common pushbacks that I get when I talk about these issues is they say, well, you first have to solve poverty. Poverty is the root of these economic disparities. It actually gets the causation backwards. The education disparities are the perpetuator of poverty rather than poverty being the cause of the education disparities. And I always push back at those folks and I say, look, every state has poverty. And how is it that some states in the country are doing much better for their low-income kids and their minority kids who are also facing tough economic situations? Why are they able to do better and we are not? And so it forces us to try to have a hard look in the mirror to figure out what are we not doing that they are doing. And so one message I want you to leave with is this is not an impossible problem to solve. We can solve this. Some states are doing it. I would point you to, I show statistics, I don't have them here. If you looked at Minnesota and Florida 20, 30 years ago, we were about the same in terms of disparities. In the last 20 or 30 years, Minnesota is right where it was before, and Florida has dramatically closed many of the gaps on racial and economic disparities. And I always say to my fellow Minnesotans, if Florida can do it, why can't we do it? And usually I don't get very good answers to that question back. And so I would just ask you to look at that for yourselves.
So let me ask this, and then I want to get to questions. So for years, quality early childhood education was seen, at least by the business community, as kind of a long-term play. I mean, that, there'd be dividends, but it's going to pay. But all of a sudden, with the workforce issue and the access to quality early childhood education and how that impacts the workforce, has there been more momentum with the business community in recent years around this issue?
I think there is because, I'm talking, so far I've been talking about just the economics of investing in low-income kids. But then there's also the workforce issue about making sure that all of your men and women in your community have the ability to do the jobs that they're trained for. There's a quirky thing about who's counted in the labor force. So let's say my wife and I, we both work. Let's say I stayed home to take care of our children and my wife worked. I would not be counted as employed. But if I then traded jobs with somebody else and you took care of my children and I took your job, now we're all counted as employed. So the person who's staying home taking care of the children is actually doing a vitally important job, vitally important to their family and to society, but they're not counted as in the labor market. So part of this is a little bit of a accounting issue. But the question is, are each of us being utilized to our full potential, doing the thing that we are best skilled at? And that's really what making sure that everybody has access to childcare so that all of our workforce is able to reach their full potential and contribute fully. And I can tell you, I'm a pretty involved dad. I don't think I'm the best child care worker you can imagine. I don't think that that's necessary. I don't think, I'm not always as patient as I would love to be. And so I don't think that would be the best use of me and my skills if the structure forced me to do that.
Right. So we have elected officials, state legislature leaders, we have our Commissioner of Education from Missouri here, we got business, community, civic leaders in the audience. So you said you wanted to leave time for questions. That's exactly what we're going to do. So if you have a question, try not, I know it's the first session, don't do that Kansas City polite thing and wait for somebody else. We would love to have the opportunity for Neel to answer some of your questions around these issues and the Fed's involvement and the business community involvement. So.
And we are, just we are live streaming this, so just for the sake of transparency, so we do need you to speak into the mic.
Yeah. So we have a microphone. I see one right there in back. So Ava's going to run the microphone back. And if you can give us your name and who you're with when you ask a question. Stand up. Don't be Kansas City polite or shy.
I'm very shy. Nate Orr, Spencer Fain. My question would be, so what did Florida do? You must have, I guess, taken a look at it. I'm just curious what Florida did do and if there were lessons that you've begun to employ here or that we could take back.
I would say Florida's done a lot of different things. Everything from giving parents more choices to more investing in teacher training to, I know one thing, I had spoken to former Governor Jeb Bush about some of his education reforms. They put letter grades, they assign letter grades on schools. The data is available if you know where to dig to look at the performance of a school, but it's hard to find. And what they tried to do is simplify it for parents, and it leads to various stages of grief. Like if there's a school down the street that you like, but then the state says, hey, this is a D, parents get really upset. But then eventually it forces people to say, I need to take a hard look at what's really going on and potentially focus on change. So it was not one silver bullet, but they did a bunch of different reforms to try to say, let's make sure that all of our children are getting access to the quality education they deserve, and in some sense forcing parents to confront the reality, because ultimately the parents ending up need to own this and drive this. And a bunch of the reforms were controversial, I think, at the time, but if you look at the results over 20 or 30 years, it's remarkable that they've made a lot of progress, and at least we in Minnesota have not.
Okay. Next, yes.
Keith Kopakin with Kopakin Brooks. There's emerging and recent research on how important early childhood development is in the brain. And I thought you might talk a little bit about that and how early intervention in the preschool years can also dictate what happens in later years and why it's so important that it happened early as opposed to any other time in a child's early development.
Thank you for raising that. So I didn't know any of this till I got to Minnesota, and it was fortunate, it was before I had children. There's this thing that they've labeled the first 1,000 days, which are the most important 1,000 days in brain development of a child, when it's the interaction with the adults, where adults are reading to the children, playing with the children, singing songs, playing games, and it's that back and forth interaction that you don't get sitting in front of the television. That ends up being so critical to, and then scientists have now studied this and can map it to how children's brains develop in those first years, those first days of life, and then how it leads to better outcomes. It turns out these are things that more well-to-do families that have more means and more education background do intuitively. But if you don't have the time, because you're working multiple jobs, and you don't have someone there to be able to take care of your children, you may not be in a position to do that. And that's a kind of a scientific lens of why is this intervention especially for these families that don't otherwise have the resources. Why is that so important? So when my kids were going through their first 1,000 days, I was like, okay, this day counts, man. This is like, we're on 775. We got to make it count. God, you can take it too far.
Ava's coming.
Hello? There we go.
There we go.
All right, I'm Jennifer Collier, Superintendent of the Kansas City Public Schools. My question for you, I think this is great that you all decided to make this investment. I strongly support pre-K education I would love to see universal. But my question for you, as you all decided to make this investment, how did you prep for the workforce? And I ask that because we know we're in the middle of a national teacher shortage. How did you all prepare for the demands that you would have? Did you have any barriers or did you run into issues? And if you did, what did you all do to take care of that issue?
So I apologize. It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to your question because we at the Federal Reserve, we do economic research. The questions that you're asking are absolutely correct and appropriate for the state and the policies that they ended up implementing and how they ended up staffing up. And so I apologize. I don't know the answer to your question. Could connect you to people who would know, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I'm going to get out of the sun here. Kalinda Calkins with BOK Financial. You talked a lot about how important it was for you to disseminate that information, that economic data, for people to understand it's not a partisan issue. Can you talk about how you did that and what channels you did to make sure people really understood the data that was coming at them and what it really meant?
I would say imperfectly, we did our best, which is we publish a lot of all of our research we publish up on our websites. We get invited, our experts get invited by groups to come and speak, just like I'm coming to speak to you today. Sometimes a legislative committee would say, hey, we want to have a technical presentation from an expert, and state legislatures would invite some of our experts in to just give a briefing on what does the research show, not getting involved in your legislation or your legislation. That's for the political body to decide. And so I would just say active engagement with the informed public as much as possible. And then, of course, social media and whatnot, just trying to stay out there and present. And then, you all share it. Those of you, a lot of people care about early childhood education. It's kind of you describe it at a high level, it's kind of an easy issue for people to feel good about. And then they pass on interesting things, and then it ends up being through word of mouth. And so we had a research director, some of you may know, who's still very active. He started this work, Art Rolnick. He's been very active nationally on these issues, and he continues to be. And so I give Art a lot of credit just for his own, the champion that he became of this research.
Neel, thanks for being with us. Rick Colley with Alliant Insurance Services. In your research, is this primarily a public solution, a public-private solution? What does your research tell you as to the best way to fix this problem?
Good question, and unfortunately, I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer. We didn't really get into how you fix it. We feel like that's the job of the elected bodies to decide, tax policy and spending and what they want to spend on. I will say that, just as our discussion has showed, business has a keen interest in this because it is about providing their workforce of the future. And so oftentimes it really is when business comes together in some form of partnership with government that we've seen the most traction take place. But I don't have any advice for you on how you ultimately were to craft a solution that would make sense for Missouri or for Kansas City. I'll say this, one of the most common pieces of feedback I get from the business community in this region is that we are structurally low on workers. If we forecast out, many businesses here say we don't know where our workers of the future are going to come from. And the first thing we want to do is look here at home and figure out, are we tapping into all of the people who are already here? Before we go and say, well, we need to find workers from somewhere else, the first question is, can we actually fully utilize the people who are here? And the answer today is no, because our education system is not serving everybody equally, and so we're leaving some people behind. And so I think business has really realized that their workers of the future and their own competitiveness is aligned with trying to fix this and address this issue.
Hi, I'm Mike Bain with Commerce Bank, and I feel compelled to represent Clint Robinson here today with a question. Clint is a longtime attendee, is in Ireland today with for his daughter's wedding, so he's not here. You mentioned, and I wish Florida were here to speak as well, but Kansas efforts so far to scorekeep, grade, whatever, have been met with extreme resistance from teachers and teachers' unions and things of that nature. Florida obviously figured that out somehow. Was that part of the problem you had here, that it didn't move forward? Or tell me the dynamics as you tried to move these concepts forward.
Yeah, I'll leave the politics for all of you to figure out. Politics can be complicated, and systems can be resistant to change, and that's all I'll say.
Good afternoon. We met just a few minutes ago. I'm Representative Brenda Shields from St. Joseph, and the people in this room know that I have been an admirer of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve since the early 2000s when I attended a conference and there was a breakout session in the Federal Reserve, the case for early childhood, and I thought to myself, why would they care? And it was a compelling presentation. I have been working in the early childhood arena ever since. In Missouri, we have tried for the past 2 years to pass legislation that is both a private and public partnership with government. We manage every year to get it out of the Missouri House with a large majority of votes, and we are always unsuccessful in the Senate because one of the arguments is that government doesn't need to be involved in the lives of families, and government doesn't need to be involved in helping businesses succeed, that is all for themselves. And those are the two barriers that we see on the Missouri Senate. So if any of you are from Missouri, we will probably bring this legislation up again this year. And if you know senators, I ask that you talk to them and you tell them how important early childhood is for your workers that I know, because we have surveyed you, that we know that so much of the time your workers don't come to work, and they cite the reason that they can't come to work is because their child care fell through. And it's not that we just need child care, but we need quality child care for every reason that you said, that those first 1,000 days are the time in which we are developing brains. So I'm sorry, I don't have a question today, really, other than I felt compelled that I need to speak, and I have just admired the Minneapolis Federal Reserve for years and have followed them for you taking the lead in pointing out this important issue for the future of our children and our country and the future workforce. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I knew that was coming at some point.
I thought there was going to be a question coming on interest rates, so I'll take that one gladly.
So within the business community, so one of the things we're going to explore where we're here is, there are a number of both American and world corporate headquarters here. Have there been particular champions of this issue within the business community?
We have a group here called the chambers are very active here. We also have a group here called the Minnesota Business Partnership, which are the CEOs of the largest businesses in Minnesota. This is an issue that they have been deeply involved in since the beginning, and I think they have been very helpful in driving this forward, again, across party lines. Again, just making the economic argument for them and the business bottom line argument for them. And so I definitely think that those are folks that you should continue to talk to.
Yeah. Good advice. Other questions? Yes.
The mic is coming to you, right behind you.
I may just stay seated because I'm kind of trapped here. It's by my own doing. I'm very familiar with the Fed data. I think others have said it, great data. But I'm curious if you have any insights into what the story was that maybe helped move the issue forward.
It's a little bit what I said earlier, which is, if you think about all the tough challenges that we face as society, this is probably the one that is easiest to get behind, because we're like, hey, don't we want little kids to get a fair chance at a better life and a fair chance at a good education, and then they can get a good job and then they can contribute? So I feel like this issue amongst all the issues that the challenges we face is probably the one that it's easier to get people behind, just because who it's about. And I don't mean that to belittle it. I mean, I think that there's a reason we all care, kind of intuitively. And so I don't have a better explanation than that, but I've not come across an issue like this where people immediately say, yeah, I get that, and you know what, that kid deserves a better shot too.
Got time for one more question. Yep.
Hi, Rob Steele with Children's Mercy, Kansas City. One of the small but significant parts of early childhood education is home visiting, and it is those types of programs have actually been one of the few that have enjoyed increased funding at the federal level. For those of you who don't know, Parents as Teachers is one of the curricula that are part of that, and that was started in Missouri. I'm curious if nibbling at that part could help expand the conversation, or if any of the research that you've done supports expanding that capability.
I've definitely heard that. I mean, I've heard that Art Rolnick, the gentleman that I mentioned, and I bumped into him a few months ago, and he mentioned that they're showing the positive returns on, even before the babies are born, starting the home visits to begin preparing the new couple, the new family with, hey, when your baby arrives, of course you need to take care of the baby and feed and whatnot, but also begin teaching them about the importance of reading to children from the earliest age. So I think all of the I haven't seen the science on that, but I'd be surprised if the science on that didn't show similar positive contributions and positive returns. The more you can just get to people and realize, hey, the most basic things that you can do, reading to your children, singing, playing with them, actually that is part of the early childhood development story, an important part of it.
So, very good. Well, let me wrap this up. I just want to say thank you, and obviously you can tell that this group is passionate about the issue. Give our chamber credit. We were talking about this issue when others weren't, just like the Fed in Minneapolis was talking about this issue when others weren't. So I think it's been a great way to kick off our trip, and Neel, we appreciate you sharing
Thank you very
with us.
much. Appreciate it.